Welcome to the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm so pleased to have as my guest Chef AJ. And Chef AJ really needs very little introduction. She's the author of several books, one called Unprocessed, one called The Secret of Ultimate Weight Loss, Conquering Cravings, Food Addiction, and Losing Weight, and one called Own Your Health. She runs the Chef AJ Daily Live, which is amazing on YouTube. She's just been involved in so many. In fact, she's doing so many things that it's daunting when I think about it. She's like the James Brown of the plant-based world, the hardest working woman in show business. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world, championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education. Anyway, welcome, AJ. How are you?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Sabatino. I kind of think of myself as the Don King because what I really like to do is promote as many plant-based people as possible to get the word out.
I love that. I love that. Listen, I got to tell you, I meet a lot of people that, are involved in this world or they're involved in making changes. I can't even tell you how many people are on that path because of your influence. And it must make you feel really good to know that, with the effort you've put out, that so many people have been kind of turned on to this way of thinking and living. So it's got to be rewarding for you.
Absolutely, because, at the end of the day, I really do care about the animals. I mean, that was my first reason for becoming vegan over 45 years ago. And so the fewer animals eaten, it just, I'm astounded that people even listen to me because I'm not a doctor, and that's the thing. So it is quite an honor to have people.
But you got the experience and you've got to say too, look, when people look at you and, I see you, they see someone who's beautiful, someone who is successful, someone who's done a lot of things and presents a lot of incredible information. But based on your story, somewhere in there's still that 11-year-old girl who was overweight as a child, who dealt with the trauma of, childhood obesity and an ethnic family very similar to the way I did that was surrounded with obesity and disease. So why don't you share that story just a little bit, how you went from that to being Chef AJ? I mean, I think it's an incredible story.
That's like literally my life story. That literally took my entire life. And that's why, people always talk about this in show business, like, an overnight success. Nobody's an overnight success. You think they are because you went to the play where they got their big break. But I mean, the first 52 years of my life, I was obese. I call myself the nouveau thin. I've only been slender for 10 years. And really, it's been the best years because I really do enjoy it. But I mean, it's horrible growing up the fat kid, and this is we live in a different world today, So if I was 5 years old and fat today, it might not be as difficult as it was in the 1960s, but it is really hard when you are the only fat kid in your class. And that's what I remember. And, I compensated by being really smart and really funny. And that's what got me through life, really, is being class clown and being teacher's pet, because it's not like I had boyfriends or anything like that,
On that path, we all have different people and things that motivate us, that inspire us. So why don't you share a little bit about what those influences are? Because, everybody winds up finding some of those influences. What were they for you? Who were the people? Who were the things? Who were the events? What turned you on?
Yeah, probably my grandfather. So my grandfather was a physician, and he graduated medical school, I think in 1920. And back then they didn't even it wasn't called internal medicine or primary care. He was like what they would call a general practitioner, right? And I remember he still made house calls, right? And what I remember seeing growing up is that he was the kind of doctor that he would go to see a patient, and because they would make house calls, and he would write a prescription. And if they didn't have the money, he would leave the money for the medicine. That's what I remember. Just seeing not just kindness and generosity, but just, altruism modeled from a very, very young age by this man, because my father was not present. Or when we would go to the synagogue on the high holidays, they would always give you this card, like to give money, and you had to push the tab over from like $5 to like whatever the highest was. And he was always pushing the highest one over. And even when he retired, he volunteered as a doctor at the Jewish Home for the Aging. So this is what I saw my whole life, is just somebody that just constantly put other people first and just wanted to do good in the world. And that he was probably my greatest role model. Dr. Joseph Harder was his name. And, he's a great doctor and a great person. And that's what I saw.
And then from there, I mean, when the difficulties came up in your own body, I know you've written and talked about this a lot, where you had your own physical ailments because of weight issues and food issues. You were living on a lot of processed things at the time. That's when your paths kind of crossed with other centers and other people in the plant-based world. Why don't you share a little bit of that and who those people were? And
oh my God, well, there's that. I mean, I admire so many people in the plant-based world, but I have to say that it really wasn't until I went to the True North Health Center as a patient that all the pieces started really falling into place, right? Because like I said, I became vegan for ethical reasons. I did not pay attention to my health. And I don't think most people pay attention to their health until they're sick, whether they're vegan or not. I mean, yes, there's a few people that Dr. Lyle calls hyper-conscientious nutcases that are proactive and will do things proactively. But I think most people take their health for granted, especially when they're younger, and don't even think about it because someday in the future, they'll quit smoking or drinking or lose weight when there's no real obvious consequences. And so for me, eating processed food was just a natural evolution of becoming vegan, because as a food addict, but not knowing I was a food addict, when I took out animal products on September 1st, 1977, that's what was left, right? Because that's what I was eating, because that's what everybody eats pretty much in the United States and the world, animal products and processed food. Now, of course, there would have been another option, which is the option I have now, eating, whole foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. But I didn't want to give up, the good stuff, meaning the addictive stuff. And so it really wasn't until I had a wake-up call of a health, I call it a health challenge, but where I went was called, I hadn't heard of True North yet. This was 2003, about 20 years ago. And so they called it a health opportunity. It was called the Optimum Health Institute. It's in Lemon Grove, California. They also have a branch in Austin that I went to. And it's vegan, but I think it's actually a religious organization run by the Essene. And I went there, and it was the first time that anyone ever told me that what we eat has a profound influence on our health. Because you don't really hear that from your doctor, or anybody. And even though I was eating without eating animal products for 26 years, I still was able to get up to close to 200 pounds just on processed food and develop what's called edematous precancerous polyps in my sigmoid colon. Because even though I wasn't eating milk, eggs, fish, cheese, fowl, any kind of animal products, I was eating sugar, flour, oil. I wasn't eating alcohol, but I was eating all kinds of inflammatory foods. And what they explained to me at the Optimum Health Institute is for disease to exist, your body has to be in a state of inflammation. And processed foods are maybe not quite as inflammatory as certain animal products, but they're certainly not health promoting. And they're certainly calorically dense, and they will make you fat and sick and miserable, as Dr. Goldhammer says. And so that was my first entry into the health arena. And when I learned that, that's when I really actually started eating S.O.S. free without calling it that, because I really hadn't heard it called S.O.S. free until I met Dr. Goldhammer. But if you think about how they eat at the Optimum Health Institute, it is S.O.S. free because there's no sugar, oil, salt, or flour, or alcohol. There's no processed food. It's, it's seeds, and they make fermented things out of seeds. There's sprouts, there's fruits, there's vegetables, those kind of things. But I've been influenced by so many people in the plant-based world because, I got to give a big shout out to Dr. McDougall, because to me, he really paved the way for so many people, so many, I think even including possibly Dr. Alan Goldhammer, just with his book, McDougall's Medicine, A Challenging Second Opinion. And I think when we think about everybody in the plant-based space, I think he's probably doing it longer than just about anyone, especially as a practicing physician. I believe it's over 50 years. And So he, I really admire him. He actually is the reason that if I am successful in this business space of being plant-based, he gave me my first break and my big break. He had a conference when we were doing in-person conferences more than we're doing them now, called the McDougall Advanced Study Weekend, which to me was like the Academy Awards. Like that was the conference that everybody wanted to speak at. Like that was the premier conference. And he gave me a chance. He actually gave me a chance 3 times. So I really admire him. But it was at the True North Health Center where I really learned from Dr. Ellen Goldhammer and Dr. Doug Lyle really kind of what McDougall was saying, but it was kind of spoon-fed to me. I had never actually this is embarrassing. I had never actually read McDougall's books until after, like later on, right? If I had, the information would have been right there, because everything in the McDougall Maximum Weight Loss Program is basically everything Dr. Goldhammer teaches. But going to True North, having that experience in a smaller group or going to lectures, I kind of had it spoon-fed to me by Dr. Lyle and Dr. Goldhammer, both the concept of calorie density, which is what Dr. McDougall teaches in his book, The McDougall Program for Maximum Weight Loss, and the concept of the pleasure trap, which was not necessarily a new concept, but the way it was articulated was new. And
Dr. McDougall, one of the strong suits, as you talk about this, was that, was at a time when carbohydrates were really vilified. And he was one of the few people that he emancipated starch in people's minds. You can eat whole grains, you can eat potatoes, you can do those things and know that those were going to support life and health and optimal weight and all of that at a time when people were freaked out. I mean, there was a time when people were afraid to eat a baked potato. You remember those times.
God,
and I remember those times, and it was crazy. It was crazy times. So I give McDougall a lot of credit for that, because he kind of pioneered that path of taking away that vilification of carbohydrate,
And people are still afraid to eat a baked potato.
Right. Well, I love it when, High Carb Hannah, one of those young vegan influencers, she went online, told people they can eat a potato, and the next minute she had 2 million followers, because everyone wants to eat a baked potato.
Oh,
you know that.
God. Yeah. Absolutely. It's inspiring to see all the younger people doing this and giving props to Dr. McDougall as well.
Yeah, and they all deserve their props. And it's true. We stand on those shoulders. We call that time binding, people that went before us. Here with Chef AJ, just having a delightful conversation. We're going to just take a few moments, a little bit of a break, to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association. And now, to put a smile on the sponsors of the National Health Association, you're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is $35 per year for those living within the U.S. and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the 2023 NHA Conference set for June 23 to the 25th, 2023 in Cleveland, Ohio, which will be the NHA's 75th annual NHA Conference. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Welcome back. I'm here with the Chef AJ, and we're talking about her evolution into becoming Chef AJ from early beginnings. Let me ask you a question, because, when you're dealing with addiction, and in your book, you talk about conquering, craving and addiction. We know that in your path and my path, there are going to be psychological and even emotional factors that play into how we look at food, how we use food to solve problems, for comfort, things of that nature. How did that play for you? I mean, coming from an ethnic family, a Jewish family, I came from an Italian family. And, it's interesting because food becomes a tool. It becomes a tool for comfort and survival. Was that something you found you needed to overcome on your path to getting into this place of being free of any craving and addiction?
Yeah, that's a good question because, being Jewish is very much like being Italian. And I know because my brother who's Jewish married an Italian girl, and there was like really, other than the accent, there was really not much difference in the in the yelling and in the passion and everything like that. The thing is it's not just Jews and Italians. I think most people use food to medicate, to celebrate, to numb, out of boredom, for all kinds of reasons. But it's like, it's funny because like when you're Jewish, if your mother's cold, you put on a sweater, right? So it's the same thing, they're always trying to feed you. They're always trying to feed you when you're Jewish. And, if you think about it, when you go to a Jewish funeral, I always remark, because I'd recently gone to my uncle's funeral, what they served is what killed him, That's what they, they're serving, basically serving deli. I mean, the only thing there, maybe the lettuce that was underneath the roast beef.
Yeah, you're sitting Shiva with the same stuff that created the situation you're in. It's very funny though, actually.
Absolutely. So, I feel like I've gone to the Dr. Lyle School of Emotional Eating because I used to argue with Dr. Lyle for years about, I'm fat because I had this bad childhood and this trauma. And, I realized that when you get, and I'm not saying people don't have trauma and don't have bad childhoods, and I feel people should get help when they need it for any experience they've had. However, when you have the food right, the emotional eating is way different. You know what I mean? Because you don't get the same hit of dopamine from, and even if you do overeat on a bag of broccoli or carrots, do people really do that? Because at a certain point, you get full from all the fiber and the water, and it's kind of boring, especially if you're not putting sugar, oil, salt on it. So I think it's sometimes, we think we're emotional eating, but it's really addictive eating. Do you know what I'm saying? Because what happens is what really broke it for me is when I was saying to Dr. Lyle, well, my parent, my dad beat the dog and, and they'd get an Oreo. And then he said to me, did you ever eat an Oreo any other time? And I'm like, yeah, I ate them like every day. I loved Oreos. The point is people are not just using these foods when the chips are down, they're using them all the time. And I think because of the addictive nature of the food, it's sometimes hard to separate addiction from emotional eating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But you did have the support of someone like Doug Lyle, who happens to be an incredibly adept cognitive psychologist, on a very high level. So, I mean, some people, when you look at the field of addiction, they always talk about the fact that the substance that you're medicating with is really the symptom and the problem is the addiction. We're talking here about the fact that when you're dealing with hyper palatable foods and the addictive process, that really kind of changes a little bit because the food itself does become problematic. But you did have a little bit of that kind of support. And I'm only asking these questions because sometimes I think people do need to break out of their isolation and their denial of, what's happening to them while they're eating these foods. And sometimes the value does come in with some counseling and support. You happen to have been very lucky in having some very cool people that, you could kind of lean on and talk to, and they kind of talked you through some of those issues. So, God. I think that's important,
And listen, lucky, yes, but other people can talk to Dr. Lyle. He actually has an open practice. Right. And that's the coolest thing. And it's like $75 for 30 minutes. And so, yes, I was lucky to find him, but he too is available for everyone. And he does a podcast like you. And, so I don't know. It's a really interesting.
The resources are there for people, which is nice. It's really
and people should get help. People, I believe in getting help and support and things like that. But I also believe that you have to get the food right, and I think
you don't want to sidestep this issue of how incredibly addictive these foods are and how they're setting that tone. Let me ask you something else, because you're coming from a family, right, where you had obesity in the family, you had disease in the family, and now you make these changes. One of the really interesting professional disappointments for me is that through, my mother was extremely overweight. She had her own addiction. She had diabetes. My father had high blood pressure. And it's kind of intriguing that through all the years that I had centers and I taught, they never heard me lecture once. They never came to a center once. did was there an opportunity, or were there changes in your family that rallied around your success? Did you have the opportunity to see benefit happen in your own family? Because it was a disappointment to me. So I'm just asking you your own experience. What was it like for you with your own family?
I want to laugh. That is so funny. I have never influenced anyone in my family in any area, especially eating. I think they are the hardest people for anyone to influence. And, it's not to say that aren't some family members that are vegan, but it wasn't because of me, because of Dr. McDougall. I used to be a very preachy, pushy vegan. It doesn't work. It actually pushes the people away. That's what I learned, because I have a dear friend named Linda Middlesworth who actually does everything wrong and opposite. And because she's so passionate and she wants everybody to be vegan, she basically just turns everybody off with the way she acts. And I learned that early on, that you can preach it to the choir, but when you preach it to people, I think it has to do with status, because I think on some level, people know that it's kind of not nice to kill animals and torture them and eat them and destroy the planet and destroy their health. And so when you're getting healthy and they're staying sick, I think they perceive it as a loss of status. So even if you say nothing, already they think you're better than them. And so it's never worked with family. And I believe me, I tried. I've lost so many family members to diabetes and amputations and cancer and things like that. But the people in my family who went vegan because they heard Dr. McDougall speak. Like, it happened with my sister and my husband. And also, in both cases, this is really interesting, they had a medical reason. It wasn't just like with me, it really was altruism. Like, I didn't go healthy vegan, but for me, it was like, eating animals is wrong. And the minute I left my mother's house at the age of 17, I'm like, I'm not doing this anymore. In my husband's case, he had terrible reflux disease and it just wasn't getting better. And when he went vegan, it was cured. He also was developing high cholesterol. And in my sister's case, she had gained so much weight and her cholesterol got so high, and she wasn't even that old yet, that her doctor was going to send her to this group for people, and like everybody there was like really heavy and really sick, and she was like, oh my God. And it just so happened that shortly thereafter they both went to a conference. Dr. McDougall spoke and they were like vegan the next meal. So that's why when you said you've influenced people, I'm honored, but I almost don't believe it, because if I wasn't so old, I'd go to medical school, because I think that's the way to do it.
Well, let me ask you about your own tolerance, because this is a good point. In your own story, you make the point that when you made transition, there were still some of those things that crept into your lifestyle, whether it be flour, junk food, vegan foods, whatever, higher oil, salt. So obviously, on your own path of evolution and change, it didn't go from here to the straight stairway to heaven. There was an in-between set of steps. But I know in your work, a lot of the foundation of what you do is to preach, abstention, abstinence. And so how do you reconcile what you found you needed to do on your path with counseling people now that you're telling they need to be completely abstinent if they want to be successful? Yeah. Talk about how you reconcile that.
That is probably the hardest thing that I have to straddle, because a lot of times people hear what they want to hear. But if you really listen to me from the day I started preaching weight loss, listen to these words: do the least restrictive program that you can do that will give you the results you seek. The problem is when people, as you know, are very susceptible to food addiction, a flexible program that involves a glass of wine, a loaf of bread, vegan cheesecake, it doesn't always give them the results they seek. And usually the result they seek is not just disease reversal, but they want, especially the women, a more slender body, but they want to get out of that constant craving for those foods. And so you're right. It took about 10 years of changing my diet to get to, like, I don't even think I'm a perfect Goldhammer diet because I use condiments that have salt, but to get, as clean as I'm eating now.
Right.
And the thing is you have to understand, though, I wasn't in a program. So I developed a program to try to help people fast track it. Like, because I didn't fast track it. I slow tracked it. I didn't start till I was about 52. Really. And, right. but the thing is I was still making positive changes in the direction towards optimum health. So for example, when I checked into the Optimal Health Institute on July 6th, it was a Sunday, 2003, with a Coke Slurpee and a Dr. Pepper. I had to drink them before I got in. That was the last time I had white sugar, knowingly. I mean, right? So like that was a really good thing. I didn't know back then about calorie density or that oil was atherogenic and obesogenic and diabetogenic. I didn't know that there were problems with salt. I didn't know that there were problems with flour. But was it still good that I gave up white sugar and stopped drinking Coke Slurpees for breakfast and Dr. Pepper for lunch? Yes, absolutely. So I always tell people any change you're willing to make in the direction to optimum health, it's still better than doing nothing. But a lot of people, because of addiction, it's too hard to do a little bit. It's too hard to do a little bit and keep all that stuff in. For me, I became a pastry chef, believe it or not, a vegan pastry chef in a non-vegan restaurant. But I didn't use sugar. I didn't want to use sugar because I knew sugar was bad. And I don't want to cook with something I can't eat. And so I started using dates like 20 years ago in desserts and making very rich vegan desserts. They were very calorically dense, but they were whole foods made out of things like nuts and dates, avocado, things like that. A lot of them would even be suitable for True North in terms of Dr. Goldhammer's guidelines, although they are calorically dense. And I use those as methadone. So you see, I didn't go from my Coke Slurpee, Dr. Pepper, junk food, vegan diet to the True North diet overnight. You're absolutely right. It took 10 years, but I didn't know about the True North diet. And would I have been able to even do it? I don't know. But having those rich desserts that were now, instead of made out of sugar, flour, and oil, being made out of dates and nuts and even cocoa powder, for me, that was so much easier. I don't know if I could have done it the other way.
Right.
I think everybody's different, but I think for some people that tearing off the Band-Aid quickly is actually less painful than keeping those tastes alive. And this is where people have to know themselves. You have to know yourself. And if what you're doing isn't working, then do something different.
I'm here with the one and only Chef AJ. AJ, where can people find you? What's the best place, locations, online, website? Where do you urge people to come to find you?
I urge them to go to YouTube because that's where I've been spending the last 3 years every day for at least an hour doing a live show at 11 a.m. Pacific time. My YouTube handle is my name, Chef AJ, but my website's Chef AJ too.
Okay. Let me touch on something that you just brought up, and that is that, when people are losing weight and they're making changes, you've emphasized, and people that have been incredibly successful, and I mean losing hundreds of pounds plus, there is a time factor that they respect. And one of the things that people are battling is not only these super hyper palatable foods, but the culture that looks for the quick fix. And there's a reason why the dieting industry is such a huge failure, spending billions and billions of dollars, because they opt for these dieting plans that are exaggerating nutrients that are putting them at risk. And yes, they can achieve a few pounds of initial weight loss, but the really successful people have done it over, months and even years. And talk to that, because, respecting that time factor while you make really healthy choices consistently across time is really the way you keep it off long term, instead of rebounding and roller coastering in this incredible death cycle of, failure and success, and then getting lost into guilt and failure. So address that time factor of recovery just a little bit from your own experience.
Well, you're the one that taught me that you need something like 1 month of recovery for every year you were addicted, or something like that. It was an incredibly long amount, which I hadn't known at the time. But what people don't realize, because when I lost weight, I didn't do it in the public eye like some of the younger influencers. I was just on my own journey because I didn't want to have knee surgery. I wasn't an influencer then, if you will, or even really a YouTuber. So I didn't document my journey. But what people don't realize, it took me 27 months. That's 2 years and 3 months to lose 47 pounds. And some people say, oh my God, that's so slow. Well, the thing is, Dr. Lau says, if you do it right, you don't have to do it over, And so, I lost, I don't know what, a half a pound a week. But the thing is, I never had to do it over. And that was the cool thing. Weight loss is not what you see on TV. Give us a week, you'll take off the weight. That's a trick. That's not real. That's water weight. Or you're, something like keto where you're just losing muscle and things like that. So it takes some time, because you not only have to change your palate, you have to change your mind, and you really have to, if you want to change your life, you have to be willing to change your lifestyle. And I think the biggest mistake that I see people make in this arena is they go on a diet. they're not really changing their lifestyle. They're doing something temporary. They're looking, they want to do something temporary and affect a permanent solution. And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, you've got to embrace that way of life mindset rather than just that temporary quick fix. So when we talk about the secret to ultimate weight loss, you've written the book. What is the secret? Tell me about it. What's really the secret that it's been for you?
Yeah, honestly, there's a few secrets within a secret, but I would say if I had to distill it to just two words, the overarching secret is calorie density, because you can't circumvent the laws of physics, regardless of your emotional state or what happened to you. You really can't. And it's not, and the thing is people don't understand calorie density. They're still confusing it with calorie counting. But
so explain that a little bit more, because we're going to have people watching this that are going to say calorie density. Okay, that sounds great. Yeah. What does it mean? So explain it to them just a little bit.
Well, again, I learned this from Dr. Goldhammer and Dr. Lyle and Dr. McDougall, but also from Dr. Barbara Rolls, who's a researcher at Penn State, who wrote a series of best-selling books called Volumetrics. And she's done more research on calorie density than any other human, because she actually has a laboratory where she studies human eating behavior. And what Dr. Rolls discovered is that human beings eat the same amount of food per day by weight. Now, maybe you and I don't eat the same amount or the same as a vegan bodybuilder, but that roughly humans eat about 3 to 5 pounds of food per day consistently. And that's what we need to feel full and satisfied. One of the reasons, many reasons that diets fail so miserably is because people are told to eat less food. And that's about as effective as telling people to breathe less oxygen. Because when you eat less food, you get more hungry. You still need to have your stretch receptors activated by large volumes of food. You still need that 3 to 5 pounds of food a day. So how do you keep eating that much food and yet lose weight? Well, when you understand calorie density, you not only can eat the same amount of food you were eating per day by weight and volume, but actually even more. Because what calorie density simply means is calories per pound of food. It's not about memorizing the amount of calories in a half a cup of rice or a cup of blueberries. It's simply knowing the average calorie density of a few food groups. But people say, well, I don't eat pounds of food. Yes, you do. You eat pounds of food a day. Unless you're anorexic or something, or maybe an infant, you do eat 3 to 5 pounds of food a day. So if you want to keep eating that, you have to eat lower on the calorie density scale, which is actually how our species evolved. Food varies in calorie density from the low end, 100 calories per pound, which is non-starchy vegetables, which is almost every vegetable other than things like, tubers and maybe parsnips, things like that, to 4,000 calories per pound on the high end, which is oil, which I don't even consider a food. So there's a 40-fold difference in the caloric density of food. That's mind-blowing to me. And the reason Dr. Roll's book helped me so much is because of the photos, because I can learn really well visually looking at pictures. And when she had photos, for example, showing that for the same amount of calories in a half a cup of raisins, you could have 2 cups of grapes, it was like, oh, see, because I like to eat more. I'm a volume. Right. And I think a lot of people are, unless they've had gastric bypass. If people are honest, most people do like to feel full and satisfied. So she had all these pictures of what you could eat for the same amount of calories. And it was like, whoa. And it simply by understanding these calorie densities of foods, for example, non-starchy vegetables is about 100 calories per pound. Fruit is 200 to 300 calories per pound. Potatoes, winter squashes are 200 to 400 calories per pound. Whole grains are 500. Beans are about 600. This is like what our species evolved eating, these whole natural foods. The reason most people are overweight and obese now isn't because they're eating too much food. It's because they're eating too many calories, because they're eating foods at a caloric density that doesn't exist in nature, that our species didn't evolve at. We did not eat oil throughout most of human history because there is no oil in nature. There's no oil tree or oil pond. You can't find oil in nature or flour in nature or sugar in nature. You find fruit. You don't find alcohol. Well, I guess you find alcohol if something ferments. But the point is, we're eating 92% of our calories from animal products and processed food, which are to what I call the right of the red line. This is a caloric density much higher than our species evolved at. And this is what you have to understand. So if you eat whole natural food, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, and keep your calorie density what I call to the left of the red line, or the average calorie density to about 600 calories per day, you can eat what's called ad libitum. You don't have to weigh and measure your food or count calories, carbs, or points. You can pretty much eat to satiety. Almost everybody can. And so that's why you have to really understand calorie density. You can't just think you understand it. You got to maybe read the McDougall Program for Maximum Weight Loss, or my book, or Dr. Roll's book, or Dr. Dean Ornish's book, Eat More, Weigh Less. There's a lot of books, the Pritikin Principle.
Right.
If you understand calorie density, regardless of what's happened to you in the past, it really is the game changer, the secret. The people that understand it, and a lot of the people that you mentioned, like these influencers like High Carb Hannah, they understand calorie density. And if you understand that, it is very possible for you to not only lose weight, but do so deliciously, eating to satiety at every meal.
And that's another point. I mean, and we can make the point that those foods with the lowest calorie density also have the highest fiber and water content. So there's a filling up effect, there's a satisfaction. They also have the greatest nutrient density. So you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. So there's so many, and it's interesting that the science has absolutely caught up, because even some of the biggest international cancer associations now are suggesting that if you want to keep cancer risk low and inflammation low, you need to take 90% plus of your diet from foods that are less than 600 calories a pound. So that calorie density idea is filtering its way even into other mainstream approaches to talk about how we can reduce cancer and major diseases. So it is so incredibly, incredibly important as you bring it up. And once you do, those foods become such second nature, and you start really looking forward to eating them. As you said, there's a satiety, and especially with fruit even being part of those low calorie dense foods, you get this panorama, this diversity that really opens up your life and opens up your mind. And that's all so incredibly important. And I know part of that, the secret also had to do not only but tying the calorie density model with the pleasure prison that people really establish by locking into these hyper palatable foods. So I know that becomes another piece of the secret that is within the secret that you talk about, as emphasized in books like The Pleasure Trap by Dr. Goldhammer and Dr. Lyle, and what other people have talked about in addiction. So when you embrace that, you've got such a set of resources for putting yourself on the right track. And I know all of that psychology was big for you too.
Circling back to, you made me think about something from an earlier question about like emotional eating and things like that. One of the things I learned from going to True North, but you can also learn it just by, reading The Pleasure Trap, was this idea that the more calorically concentrated the calories, the more dopamine is released in the brain, this neurotransmitter that's released whenever we have a pleasurable experience. So I didn't know any of this. I didn't know that eating, produced dopamine in the brain. I didn't even know what dopamine was, until I went to True North. But this idea that if people are, trying to medicate with food, they're going to choose the foods that are most calorically dense, because they're not going to get it from steamed kale. They're not going to get it from the lower calorically dense, the calorically dilute foods, for example. But, when you think about it, the foods that most people are medicating with, these are foods that don't exist in nature. These are the processed foods. These are foods that were designed to be addictive, sugar, flour, oil.
Right.
And this other thing that I learned from Dr. Lyle and Dr. Goldhammer is that we weren't meant to activate those pathways at the same time. So in other words, if you look at nature, with the exception of breast milk, you're never going to find a food that has sugar and fat together, that has sugar and salt together, that has fat and salt together, or that has sugar, fat, and salt together. But that's exactly what processed food and restaurant food is. So they knew that sugar, fat, and salt were addictive. There's books about this, Salt, Sugar, and Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us, by Michael Moss. Hooked by Michael Moss. And they knew this. And so they put these together. And so, one of the things I want people to know, look, if you're addicted to processed food, it is not your fault. It was designed to hook you. And if you're not addicted, you're probably one of the rare individuals like my husband or Doug Lyle that can have a cookie, actually half a cookie. It drives me crazy. We have this friend, and she works at True North, Kathy Fisher, and she's lovely. I love her to death. And she's one of these naturally slender people. And then she'll come visit us, and then we'll go out, and I don't even like eating at restaurants, but I'll make an exception. And then they'll eat. And then Kathy goes to Charles, she goes, "Do you want to share a cookie?" I'm like, who shares a cookie? A cookie is a one serving unit. That's why it's a cookie. You don't share a cookie, but
No.
they don't suffer with food.
We share a box of miniature pastries, honey, not a cookie. That's what that's the way it always was.
They
I want to make a point though, because what the research is showing, and you made such an incredibly important point about calorie density, we're finding that because you can eat the volume of food because of the low calorie density, that actually volume can take the place of calorie density for pleasure experience in the brain. So by being able to have that increased volume while you're not eating those dense foods, you will still establish a kind of bliss point with dopamine just because you're able to eat the sheer volume that you're able to with these foods. And that's a very important point, because when you abruptly take away those hyperpalatable foods, there can be a withdrawal because of that dopamine response. And so it does make it a little difficult to hold your ground sometimes when you're first making those changes. But boy, by embracing that volume and calorie density, it can really help and really change that.
And
so
I agree.
Go ahead.
Because there is a period, I went to the Optimum Health Institute and I had a detox for like almost a week. A lot of people are trying to do this at home, in an unhappy marriage, with a stressful job, so I get it. It can be difficult. Detox can be horrible, but that's how you really know this stuff's addictive, that you can't quit.
Right. Well, I want to really thank Chef AJ for taking the time to share her experience, her words of wisdom. And I absolutely encourage you to go to her YouTube channel, follow her incredible, interviews and the recipes that she affords you, and really gives you the tools to help you stay on this incredible plant-based track. And I want to, and the notes, the show notes will show those locations, those sites. And I truly want to thank our viewers out here, because without you, I couldn't do this and we couldn't do what we're doing here. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I want to thank you for being part of this incredible active community. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next podcast. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.